Hey, this is Katrina Bird again, or my patients call me Dr. Bird. Welcome to my channel. So today we're going to talk about penicillins. So let's get started. All right, so before we jump into the antibiotics, it's important that we go through a few basics first. So my mantra is if you understand where the site of action of the antibiotic occurs, you will understand what it covers. So today we're going to go over penicillins, which attacks the cell wall. So let's just kind of go through some basics about the cell wall and gram staining first before we jump into the antibiotics. So in regards to the how do you perform a gram stain, these are the following steps. So number one, you take a culture, you apply it to the slide and either allow it to air dry or actually heat fix it. Basically, you allow the liquid sample to dry on a slide, and then once it's dry, you place the slide over a heat source, and we call that heat fixing. Then you place the first stain, which is your crystal violet solution, on. Next, you fix it with iodine. Then you decolorize it. This is important because it will get rid of any excess color there and create a perfect palette for you to apply your last stain, which is safranin red stain. So in general, your gram-positive bacteria are going to stain blue and your gram-negative bacteria are going to stain red. So this is another slide that takes a closer look at this. So as you see, the bacteria are initially colorless. Then you add the crystal violet stain, you add your iodine step, then you decolorize it, and notice that for your gram-positive, it's going to stay kind of purplish. However, in a gram-negative bacteria, the decolorizing state is going to bring it back to that neutral color. And then you apply your last stain, which is your safranin stain, or safranin red. So let's take a closer look at the cell wall. So in a gram-positive bacteria, this slide is a little bit busy, but the one thing I want you to get from this is that it has a huge peptidoglycan layer. So this is basically the background of the cell wall. So this is important to kind of think about it like a sponge. And so because it's so big and it's so thick, that's why it's going to retain that initial stain, which is your crystal violet stain. There are also other things like virulence factors such as the teichoic acid and lipoteichoic acid, but we won't go into details for those things. However, when you look at the gram-negative bacteria, it has a small peptidoglycan cell wall. So think of this, if it's a sponge and it's kind of small, it's not going to be able to retain much fluid. So that is why after the initial stain, it's able to be decolorized and it's gonna retain the last stain, the last dye that you put on it, which is your safranin, which is a reddish type stain. So I hope this helps you remember that gram-positive bacteria is purple. It has a big peptidoglycan layer, so it's gonna be like a sponge and retain that crystal violet dye. And then your gram-negative bacteria has a very small peptidoglycan layer. It's not going to be able to retain the initial stain, and it's going to subsequently retain the last stain. All right, so let's talk a little bit more about peptidoglycan. So the actual layers, well, peptidoglycan is layers. It's a kind of layered structure. So it's made of NAG and NAM, which is N-acetylglucosamine and N-acetylmuramic acid. So they kind of alternate. And that's your solid kind of wall structure, your layer. And the kind of cement in between the walls are going to be your peptide bridge. So this is individual amino acids that are linked together, and each of the chains are cross-linked to make a stabilized structure. So when you think about peptidoglycan, I want you to take a look at this cake. Oh my God, it looks so good. But basically, think of this like peptidoglycan. So in a cake, you've probably never seen a multi-layer cake with no icing in between or no icing around it. And you're probably like, why? The icing in a multi-layer cake stabilizes the structure. It's necessary so that it doesn't topple over when you're cutting out a piece for yourself and your friends. So the peptidoglycan is the same way. The individual walls are in layers, and the peptide bridge helps stabilize the structure. And this is how it works. Okay, so this is important when we think about how do antibiotics kill bacteria. So if I want to mess up or break down this peptidoglycan wall, I'm going to interfere with the formation of this peptide bridge, as you see in the structure. So let's go deeper. So specifically, a couple things happens when we think about how antibiotics, specifically penicillins in this case, kill bacteria. One, it recognizes penicillin binding sites. So PCN is how I'm going to abbreviate penicillin, and you may see that throughout the presentation. So you see this woman trying to look for something. That's because the penicillin binding site is on the bacteria. So when the antibiotic sees this, it says, oh, okay, that's bacteria I can kill. So that's one way in which it recognizes the bacteria that it can kill. Next, the other thing is the antibiotics inhibits transpeptidation and cross-linking. So this is how it interferes with the formation of the peptidoglycan wall. It messes up that peptide bridge. So another way to think about it is it removes the icing in between the layers. And so when you have a multi-layered cake, it's unstable because it has no icing. Same thing, same principles. All right, so, okay, well, the bacteria is like, okay, I see you antibiotics, so how can I become resistant? So let's talk about some mechanisms of resistance. Before we go deeper, let's look at the structure of the penicillin. So this is penicillin. It's not something that you absolutely need to memorize. I just wanted to show you where the site of the beta-lactamase works. So beta-lactamase, well, let me back up. So this kind of square structure is the beta-lactam ring. So you may have heard that penicillins are an example of a beta-lactam. So it's because when you hear that, it's specifically referring to this square-like structure. So this arrow kind of represents where a beta-lactamase, or an enzyme that breaks down beta-lactams, will work. So breaking that down, kind of cleaving this bond between right here kind of makes this structure even more stable than it is in its current state. So that's why, beta-lactams like to act here. Okay. So let's go deeper into the mechanisms of action. So one, remember I just told you that it's important for antibiotics to recognize which bacteria they can kill by recognizing penicillin binding site. So the bacteria is like, okay, I see you. So what I'm going to do is change my penicillin binding site. So when it does that, the antibiotics can't recognize, that, oh, they can kill that bacteria. So then bacteria sneaks away. The next thing they do is, as we've just stated, they have beta-lactamase. So basically, before the antibiotic can even try to kill it, it breaks it down to a state that is no longer harmful to the bacteria. All right, penicillins. So your most narrowest spectrum, and when I think about antibiotics, I don't think about strong and weak, because it doesn't matter. Like, as long as you are able to kill the bacteria, that's all that's needed. So specifically how we frame, or how infectious disease people frame how we talk about bacteria, we think about spectrum. So narrow spectrum, meaning that they only kill a small number of bacteria, and broad spectrum, meaning that they kill a lot of different bacteria. So for penicillins, we're going to start off with talking about Penicillin G, which is IV, and Penicillin V, which is oral. So these are going to be our narrow spectrum penicillins. So here I have like a picture of the different stages of syphilis, because Penicillin G is still the treatment of choice for syphilis. The other thing you're going to use penicillin for is to treat strep. It's an extremely good strep medication. Here, this is an example of strep pyogenes. So just remember, strep and syphilis are your two main things you're going to use penicillin to treat. Next. So then the bacteria started getting hip to penicillin. They were like, look, I see that all y'all giving me is penicillin, so I'm going to start becoming a little more resistant. So then we had to come up with more antibiotics. So now we go into our Naficillin, Methicillin, Oxacillin. So Methicillin is more of kind of a classical antibiotic. We don't really use that anymore. We do, however, use Naficillin primarily, and some institutions use Oxacillin. So this is a picture of Staphylococcus aureus. So it's kind of this grape-like structure. It's round. And so Staph aureus, or MSSA, methicillin-sensitive Staph aureus, Staphylococcus aureus, is going to be the primary bacteria that you're going to use these medications for. Next is our Amoxicillin and Ampicillin. So what I love about these is this is when you really start getting a little gram-negative coverage in your penicillin group. So I have just two examples of gram-positive and gram-negative bacteria. So a couple key points. This is a treatment of choice for vancomycin-sensitive Enterococcus. So Enterococcus used to be a strep. So it kind of makes sense that, penicillin is going to kill it. It's also the first-line treatment for listeria. There are other medications that also treat listeria, but remember ampicillin. This is why in babies, we typically will add ampicillin when we don't know what's going on, because we know for neonatal sepsis, listeria is a key cause of infection in kids. Same thing with elderly. If someone is coming in with fever, altered mental status, confusion, headache, we will add ampicillin to cover for listeria, just in case that elderly person is coming in with listeria meningitis. Lastly, like I said, it also gives us a little bit of gram-negative coverage. All right, so however, ampicillin and amoxicillin are still susceptible to beta-lactamase producing bacteria. So we decided to overcome that. So how do we overcome it? So for amoxicillin, you add clavulonic acid to make Augmentin. That's the brand name. And then for ampicillin, you add sulbactam to make Unasyn, which is also the brand name. So adding these groups to the ampicillin, amoxicillin will make your new antibiotic beta-lactamase resistant. So this is just a little bit of text to support what I'm saying. All right, so now let's go through the broadest spectrum of our penicillin group, which is going to be Ticarcillin-Clavulonic acid and Piperacillin-Tazobactam. So Ticarcillin-Clavulonic acid is also called Ticarnic. Also, Timitin is another brand name for that. And for our Piperacillin-Tazobactam, Zosyn is the brand name for that. So for this, it covers so many things. It's much easier to talk about what it doesn't cover. So a few of the examples of things it does not cover include MRSA and we didn't talk about this. So MRSA uses two of the mechanisms of resistance that we talked about. So one, it produces beta-lactamases, so it basically cleaves the antibiotics before it can work on the bacteria. And two, it changes this penicillin binding site. So then a lot of antibiotics can't recognize MRSA to try to kill it. Next, listeria. So this ESBL stands for extended spectrum beta-lactamase. So if bacteria produces a ESBL, or extended spectrum beta-lactamase, then Zosyn or Ticarcillin-Clavulonic acid is not going to be the treatment of choice for this. So it's important when we kind of talk about these, I just put ESBL, but when you're like speaking to other people about it, oh, I have this ESBL, like that doesn't make sense and is commonly said. So you should say, I have an ESBL producing E. coli, or I have an ESBL producing Klebsiella. That makes more sense because I'm like, oh, okay, well, because the ESBL is not a type of bacteria, it's just a type of enzyme that a bacteria can produce. So just a little key point in regards to how we're communicating our infections to our colleagues. So last, vancomycin resistant enterococcus, these antibiotics do not treat. So another name is VRE, is what you commonly know it as. So for dosing information, please check out my IG account. And that's all I have for you for today. Hope you enjoyed.